Me and my girlfriend went dispersed camping in Flagstaff and had a really weird experience. Hi all, me and my girlfriend decided to head up to Marshall Lake in Flagstaff, Arizona to do some dispersed camping. It was beautiful during the day, but the moment the sun went down, we decided to put the fire out and head to the tent since it was so cold outside. The moment the sun went all the way down, we were laying in our tent and getting ready to get some sleep, even though it was early. Keep in mind, we were in the middle of nowhere, with no one nearby, probably 1.5 miles from the closest tent we saw. 30 minutes into laying down, me and my girlfriend heard two very distinct footsteps right behind our tent. We didn't hear anything walk up, and it was so close, we grabbed our bear spray and decided to poke my head out the tent to see if anything was nearby. Absolutely nothing. We go back to our sleeping bags pretty spooked, and then 15 minutes later we heard it again, and we decided we didn't feel safe and left. We hiked out of the woods and got a motel. Are there skinwalkers out here? Because we saw no animal tracks behind our tent, and we know for certain I heard footsteps around our tent. This happened tonight, and it was a full, very bright moon. I don't know if that makes a difference. I don't know anything about skinwalkers and didn't even begin to believe in them until now. We heard someone unloading shots at something at 1.2 during the night. We believe it was from the campers 1.5 miles away at the head of the trail. I thought it was odd that someone shot one magazine and didn't shoot any more. But as we hiked back out about an hour later, they also packed their camp and left as well. We safely got all of our gear and got out of there and home safely. Please, everyone, be safe camping or hiking around Flagstaff. I'm not one to post these kind of things. I mostly just have Reddit to look at bugs and read about roommate drama. But I had an experience in the woods one night almost 10 years ago that got brought up recently and thought I'd share here. I snuck out of the house to go smoke weed in Lynn Ma Woods at about 3 a.m. It's not a huge sector of woods, just a wee reservation smack dab in the middle of the Boston suburbs, surrounding the local I got to the entrance of the trail, parked my car, and made my way to the campsites, about a 5-min walk, where there were fire pits available. It was a popular smoking area for teenagers, and I was one of them. I set up to draw by the fire I had made and begin to roll a joint. As I was rolling, I had heard something on 4 legs come up from behind me. I didn't sweat it that much because where I'm from, the worst it could be was probably a coyote. But then you could hear it transition into 2 legs and walk with a bipedal gait. That confused me. Then everything went fucking silent. No crickets, no birds, nothing. The only thing I could hear at that point was the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Then I became really concerned, like something bad was about to happen. I call out, thinking maybe it was just a homeless dude working up the courage to ask me for some food or some money, since it was the city after all. I say hello and ask if anyone's there. Silence still. For about a minute, everything's telling me to run, but I stay, because I thought if it was an animal trying to hunt me, I should stand my ground and make myself appear I'm not worth the risk. Then, whatever it was, it talked. It sounded almost like a parrot mimicking its owner's voice, and it asked to bum a light. "Can I bum a light?" it said. At first, I'm relieved, because at least I know it's not an animal, but the way it spoke was truly uncanny. I said, "Sure, but you have to come out where I can see you. You're giving me the creeps, dude." And then it asked again, and again 3 times. Then I was really freaked and knew something was really wrong. I then told it to fuck off and find someone else to ask if he was going to be creepy about it. Then it ran off on all 4s. You could hear all 4 feet hitting the ground as it ran away. The crickets came back, the night birds started to chirp again, and the air even felt warmer. That feeling of dread washed over me, and I knew I had to fucking book it. I calmly pack all my stuff back up, put out the fire, and make my way back down the trail to my car. I wanted to run, but part of me still believed it was just a dude trying to get creepy with a 16-year-old girl in the woods by herself, and if I played it cool and acted like I wasn't scared, maybe he'd back off. My mother always taught me to make a scene in that scenario, and I was prepared to knife whatever came at me. I also thought maybe if it was an animal, I wouldn't trigger its hunting instincts if I just walked instead of. But man, every hair on the back of my neck was standing up. That feeling of being watched is definitely real. I finally see my car about 200 feet ahead of me. I feel safe again, but I'm still on alert. I feel secure enough to look behind me. And sure enough, maybe 40 feet behind me is a male deer on its hind legs in the middle of the trail. I fucking freak. I've never heard of a skinwalker, never believed in anything like them at the time, never even knew what they were. But I knew something about that image was seriously wrong, and I lost my composure and booked it to my car. I made it back no problem and drove off before I could even turn my headlights on. To this day, I'm 24, about to turn 25, I have never been back to those woods, or really any woods for that matter. I'm deathly afraid of nature now, which sucks. The very idea of spending a night in them makes me so anxious I feel nauseous. It wasn't until years later, when I fell into a YouTube rabbit hole in college, when you just pick one video suggested on your recommended page and let autoplay take you wherever, that I stumbled on a video that described skinwalkers and alleged experiences people have had with them in the woods, that I truly began to understand what I may have encountered that night. This shit is real. IDK if they're as aggressive or dangerous as people make them out to be in the stores I've seen online, because in my experience it seemed pretty curious and backed off when I confronted it, still thinking it was just a creepy dude looking to score. But to this day, thinking about it makes me shudder, and I get a put in my stomach. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on this. I'd love to have this debunked even. I loved those woods and sort of wanted to just have been a weird dude. But I've heard some weird, very similar stories from the locals about those woods, and now I don't know what to think. About 2 months ago, my husband and I were staying in a camper on a friend's property in northern Wisconsin. One night, I wasn't feeling very well, so I went and laid down in the camper and promptly fell asleep. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., I suddenly woke up and bolted out the door and started projectile vomiting outside by the window. My husband called out and asked if I was okay. I managed to say yeah in between rounds. When I finally finished and felt like I was okay to go back and lay down, I spit a few more times to get rid of the taste, and as I looked up, there was a face about 3 feet in front of me in the darkness. I stared at it, and at me. I was petrified. I couldn't move, but I was also afraid to take my eyes off of it. I slowly started to move my head up, down, and side to side to try and get a better angle or a closer look. And as I did so, it began to mimic my movement. There we were in the darkness of the forest, bobbing up, down, back, forth, slowly leaning closer and closer to one another as we try to figure each other out. I stared straight into its cold, hollow eyes. I couldn't look away in fear of what would happen if I did. It stared back at me, almost as if it didn't know what I was either. It was too dark to make out any features, but the face had the shape of a human face, but what I could see on the body from behind the truck just looked hunched over and distorted. We stayed that way for what felt like forever until I finally managed to call out, "Babe?" "Yeah," my husband responded. "There is something out here," I said, only slightly raising my voice. "What?" he asked. "I don't know, some kind of animal?" Not sure, but I'm afraid to move. It's just watching me," I whispered, almost to myself. He opened the door of the camper and looked out into the darkness. "Where?" he asked, unable to see what I was seeing. "It's right in front of me, just watching," I told him, bewildered, that he couldn't see it. He grabbed a flashlight and shined it in front of me, and it was gone. There was nothing there. I never saw it leave. I kept its cold, dead gaze the whole time. How could it not be there? I am still very confused by this interaction. I know it was there. I saw it. It wasn't a dream. And I know I was hallucinating. Can anybody tell me what they think it was? Just to respond to a few comments. I don't drink and I don't do drugs, so I was not inebriated. I don't remember all the details because I couldn't see very well, but here's what I got. I couldn't tell how tall it was because from what I could see it looked hunched over and disfigured. I don't think it had any fur. It was pale in color, but again it was dark, so I'm not sure what color it was. It had big, black, soulless eyes, like looking straight into a void. It had sharp, jagged teeth, and I don't remember a nose at all. Hope this description helps. Maybe it wasn't a skinwalker because I guess they don't leave Navajo land, but it was really scary. I should also mention that where I was in the woods of Wisconsin was not too far from the Hannahville Indian Reservation in Menominee County, MI. But again, not Navajo, so I'm not sure what it was. This happened a couple hours prior to when I'm writing this. A buddy of mine had met me at McDonald's for dinner tonight. Normally, we'd hit Waffle House, but it was already packed. We started talking about dumb stuff we did as kids, and it eventually became creepy stuff we saw as kids. I brought up how back when I was in the Boy Scouts during one of our campouts, a troop camped a little further away from mine had an expensive, allegedly wildlife-proof cooler full of raw meat raided by a pack of coyotes. For laughs, my buddy said, "Like a skinwalker?" And I said, "Maybe," but that I sure as hell wasn't getting out of my tent in the middle of the night to investigate. Rather quickly, I changed the subject. When I was driving home, I slowed down slightly to go through a school zone. For reference, I live in Henry County, GA, where speed cameras are kept on 24/7. I slow my truck to 30 miles an hour. I hear a voice over the rumble of my V8 engine whisper, "Speed up, they'll catch you, they'll catch you." Writing it off as radio static or the product of a tired mind, I sped up slightly and kept going down the back road until I hit a four-way stop. And then I saw it, a massive dog like a dark cloud with glowing greenish-blue eyes. They looked like a cat's eyes when a flashlight is shown on them. It was huge. Its shoulders easily could have matched the height of my truck bed, and it was barreling towards me, dangerously close to tail-grabbing my ass Smokey Bear style. The air inside my cab went cold despite the closed windows and running heater. As I noticed water vapor exit my mouth, needless to say, I gunned it and nearly flipped my truck doing 95 miles an hour the whole way home. Was this a skinwalker? Did I encounter a black dog? First-time poster on this sub. I've been holding on to this story for a number of years, since every so often there's a good time to tell it, and I felt that I should finally post it here to get people's thoughts on it. I'd like to apologize in advance, as I'd like to think I'm a decent storyteller in person, but pretty lackluster / long-winded with text. Also, as I write about later, I try and use animal noises to describe some sounds. Take them all with a grain of salt, as even I know that's not the exact thing I heard, but the closest sound I can relate it to or describe it with. I go between I and we a couple of times, as I describe at the end. My friends and I all discussed what happened to confirm we all in fact heard the same thing and had the same experience. To preface the story and where it takes place, I grew up in the Huron region of Ontario. For those not familiar, it's about a 3-hour drive directly west from Toronto, where I now live, on the shore of Lake Huron. Not far from the area the tales of the Black Dauntless are from, for you dark history lovers. During my time in high school, there was one teacher who had talked about his experiences in a small forested place called Lob's Bush. Although I wasn't very familiar with it at the time, it was known by a fair number of locals as a very haunted place in the area, or where people have had unexplainable but startlingly similar encounters. This teacher was very outspoken about his experiences in that bush, but also his steadfast trust in being a non-believer in the paranormal / supernatural, which in turn made him of all people the most fascinating to hear it from. Always ends his stories or answers questions with, "I don't believe it, can't explain it, I'm just telling you what happened." A few years later, in the winter of 2017, both after having him as my teacher in high school and having since moved away to attend my first year of university, I came back to my hometown for my winter break to spend some time with family and catch up with my friend group. For anyone familiar with the small-town experience, our favorite activity was the age-old classic of buying a terrible number of cheap reservation cigarettes, hopping in one of our friends' terribly run-down beater cars, and then smoking, chatting, and playing the worst music ever conceived until either the smokes or the gas tank runs out. We were all hovering around 16 or 18, so this was just the most fun, degenerate things we could do. On top of finally having a break from all my uni coursework, this was the first time seeing these friends in a couple of months, so we were all excited to be one big group again. I won't bore you with all the earlier antics of the evening, but where this story picks up is after driving around, catching up for a few hours, we pit stop at a random bush trail so some of us could smoke some weed. As we started walking down one of the trails, I remember feeling a very stark change in the atmosphere around us. I didn't really want to express my feelings to ruin the mood, but I definitely felt the need to be on high alert. I've never really had a way to describe the physical feeling, apart from my chest feeling heavy, but somehow it was very clear that something was watching us and did not want us there. Every few steps I needed to look back to make sure something wasn't stalking us. All we had were our phone flashlights, which had a very short distance. The way the trail sat in the bush, it was all new trees, so they curled over the path to almost form a tunnel. It looked as if we had walked into the maw of a massive creature, slowly making our way down its throat. We only made it about a few hundred meters before realizing that the calm night was turning into a winter storm. We all agreed to go back to the car and would start making our way home before it got any worse. By the time we made it back to the car, the trees were swinging wildly in the wind, and the snow made it hard to see the next couple of feet in front of us. Once we made it to the car, we started to drive back to the closest town so as to stay at a friend's place to wait out the storm. While driving, the weather continued getting worse until the snow had practically blinded us while going around a notable halfway there turn. We found out that our estimate of how far to turn the car wasn't enough, and felt the car's momentum stall and slide sideways into the ditch. After a short period of us hurling claims of backseat driving and general frustrations, we ended up staying in the ditch for around 5 hours before being rescued by local police and driven the rest of the way into town. During our time in the ditch, I talked about how I felt while walking in the woods. We all agreed with the feeling of knowing we shouldn't be there, and none of us spoke up until now. Only after that did our friend in the driver's seat, and the only one familiar with these particular back roads, inform us that we were in fact walking through Lob's bush. Fast forward some time to, I believe, my second semester reading week. I'm back home with my friends and back to our same old acts. After a particularly good night of catching up, we decided to go revisit Lob's bush, as none of us had been there since getting caught in the ditch, and the weather was already warm this month with far less snow. I remember feeling almost excited to go back, rather than dark, impenetrable clouds and snow. Tonight, the moon was out and barely needed flashlights to see where we were going. We parked the car in the same spot and grabbed all necessary smoking apparatus and a pack of smokes for the driver and me to share, as of course neither time are we dumb enough to get our designated driver high. As we started walking into the trail, I started realizing landmarks that I had missed from my first time there, with the moonlight making everything more visible. I walked through the same threshold as before, and was pleasantly surprised that I didn't feel like I was watched or unwelcome to walk through. After a point, I had almost forgotten that I was in the infamous woods and was enjoying a late-night walk through the forest, laughing with my friends. After walking further down the trail, we finally came to an opening. On the right side of the trail, the trees had parted out to showcase the edge of a field, nicely lit by the moonlight. On the left side, the bush clears out so there is a lovely section of grass and light foliage parting to show a small stream cutting through. It looked like a naturally made auditorium, with the stream cutting through like a main walkway, sparse trees, so plenty of seating for an audience, and the trees opening and leading down to the farmer's field as the stage. In all honesty, I had completely forgotten we were there to smoke and was just enamored with how pretty it was. As we found a spot to stop and ready our lights to smoke, one friend had the bright idea to exclaim, "Yo, I forgot I've got a Roman candle." As we all turned to look, they had already gotten their lighter out and was proceeding to light the candle. Hearing we were late teens, we were idiots. She proceeds to point the candle towards the big clearing to the field, every once in a while moving it around so it is not all shooting in the same spot. Going higher and higher into the air, she finally points it in the opposite direction towards the wood. With surprising accuracy, none of the shots actually hit anything before going out, until one finally hits a tree near the stream and spirals into the woods where we can't see it. Within no more than a second's time, this blood-curdling scream comes from the exact place the Roman candle bounced into the woods beyond our view. We all completely froze, unsure of what to make of it as the scream continued on for a worrisome amount of time. I can only describe it as a cross between a deeper version of a howler monkey's roar and an ear-ringing whine like an elk's bugle, going higher in pitch as it kept screaming. I remember my ears vibrating from how loud it was. I wanted to cover them, but we were all frozen in place from it. Finally, one of us snapped into reality and yelled, "Run!" and bolted off towards the farmer's field. We all in turn started running away from the ongoing scream from within the woods. As we were running, the scream finally stopped after about 10 seconds of constant noise. There was no breath or change in the scream apart from pitch. It was able to yell at that volume for longer than I've heard any animal do. Before we could even think, we heard a heavy rustling in the woods as whatever it was took a deep inhale to scream again. The inhale was just as terrifying, sounding like an alligator's bellow mixed with a hyena's laugh. I know both sounds I'm describing are from exhaling, but you could tell this was a guttural, full-chested and preparatory inhale before screaming again. Unlike the first scream that almost sounded reactionary, surprised by the Roman candle almost hitting it, this was clearly an angry roar. Whatever it was really fucking big and now moving towards us. It was even louder and what I could only assume was now pointed towards us. Even though we were all heavy smokers at the time, we all ran as fast as we possibly could without looking back, absolutely terrified from the second continuous roar that was now gaining on us. After about 15 seconds, the scream stopped abruptly. It took us a second to realize the noise was gone. We turned around to see that we'd made it out of the woods and onto the field. We only looked back briefly to see we had put about 5,000 meters between us and the edge of the bush. Even before we could really think straight, we shakily agreed to make our way to the closest road to make our way back to the front of the bush to find where we parked. It was only once we got to the road and caught our smoked-out breath did one of us finally ask if we all heard and felt that. We all talked briefly but were too on edge to actually converse. About 20 minutes later, we finally made it back to the road and had the car in sight. We all started to calm down as we had some time to process and let the adrenaline wear off. We unlocked the car, all got into our respective seats with our bags. None of us had the time to take it off before the first scream happened. As the driver finally turned the car on and the headlights flooded the woods in front of us, the front passenger just screamed, "Drive, drive, drive!" The driver, without looking, cranked the car into reverse and turned around to back out quickly and go down the back road as fast as he could beside the bush. The friend who screamed started to freak out all over again. I was sitting directly behind him with my hand on his shoulder from the back seat. As we tried to ask what was wrong, I was looking over my shoulder to look into the woods. I genuinely felt like time had slowed down as I looked over, with the same feeling of something watching me like my first time in the woods. As the trees passed by, I could clearly make out two fully open eyes reflecting back at me. I could clearly make out two full reflective circles. I was completely frozen and couldn't look away. I couldn't tell if the eyes were locked on me or the whole vehicle, or even what light they were reflecting off of as we were driving beside the woods. They were clearly further back into the woods by a couple of meters, so I couldn't make out how tall it was, but I could very easily see they were attached to a head much larger and taller than a human. I completely forgot about comforting the passenger in front of me and instead tried to turn and see it for longer through the back window. as we kept driving but had completely lost the visual. I couldn't even make a sound, but my mind was racing. The longer I sat, the longer I wondered how the hell it got to where I could see it after we had sped away from the parking spot. I don't know how much it saw from the car, but I know it saw me. It saw all of us in those woods. I don't know how to describe it other than that I was fully prey, and whatever it was a predator that knows me now. After driving for a while on our way back to a friend's farm, we were all able to speak about what had happened. We all heard the same noises, heard the rustling, heard the same far too long screams, and finally the other passenger and I both agreed on seeing the same wide eyes staring at us. Neither of us got a good look at what it was, but both agreed that it's staring at us and was too big to make out. That passenger also made a comment that even though it was a couple of meters into the woods when he saw it, it had to be much bigger than a human. After a couple of hours more conversing about it, we all finally felt comfortable driving back to our respective homes. Every couple of months, when we'd see each other, we'd make certain to each other that we all saw the same thing, as we wanted to make sure none of us were truly losing it mentally. I sat the events of this story for about a year, not really sure who to tell or who would believe any of us for that matter. Once I finally felt comfortable talking and researching things similar, I came to the personal conclusion that it might be something along the lines of a skinwalker, and started looking further into stories about it. As there was so much talk of people having similar encounters or strange happenings in Lob's Bush, I really wanted to entertain and research any and all possibilities. On top of that, although raised somewhat Christian in school, it was never a dogma I really followed or was heavy into the idea of other powers until this happened. For me, if this was real and it happened to me, I couldn't disprove anything, and has vastly changed the way I look at any form of religion or spiritual beliefs. Through friends and a few events, I know a fair number of indigenous groups and older members that I felt believed enough of the old ways to tell this story. All three elders essentially said the same thing, along the very blunt line of, "Yup, that sounds like a skinwalker," and a few shared similar encounters that other friends and family have had. Only within the last, I think 2 years, I talked to a few more people about it, and one friend finally recommended that I Google what a skinwalker sounded like. I finally looked online and heard some very similar sounds that sent the same "it's watching" chills down my spine, and felt that on top of everything else was enough confirmation for me. To this day now have started my own spiritual path with respect to the lands, and especially now being on Turtle Island that I walk on. In addition to the classic, don't whistle or say its name at night, I've made it very clear to my close friends who have all heard this story and respectfully know me as the outdoorsy camping friend, that if I ever feel anything similar to being watched, or that we shouldn't be in these woods, to get the fuck out with me. So, this is my story of what I believe was my encounter with a skinwalker. I thought it would be good to share this on the sub. If you have any questions, please let me know and I'll answer them the best I can. I've also attached backup links and an additional interview link to someone's project on Lob's Bush made about 10 years ago too. For context, that teacher was also named Lob. It's about as common as the last name Smith where I'm from. Let me preface this with some facts about me. I'm not by no means a writer or a person that really shares stories or anecdotes in the written form. I'm a talker, usually. I also am not or wasn't believer in the paranormal. After this experience, I believe in something. This is a fairly short story of an experience I had around 3 years ago, during a time my wife and I were having issues. No idea if that affected the events or not, but just a weird correlation. I was alone, kids were put to bed late on a chilly Sunday night, in or around October. I had been preparing for the week of work that lay ahead for me, as well as unpacking a lot of stuff from boxes, which were then stacked up neatly at the front door of my house. I was trying to do things around the house to impress or please my wife, who had gone to stay with her mother in a neighboring city. We had been having problems for the better part of a year, so I was feeling lonely and depressed and just generally down on myself that weekend. I lived on the corner of one of the main roads in my town at the time. Giant high school right across the street. Lots of traffic usually, though it slows down around 11 on the road. It's still busy enough the cops would set up traffic stops from time to time later at night. The other part of the corner I lived on is a dead-end road with 4 houses, counting mine. A single guy with an adult son, an elderly single woman, and a couple that doesn't have kids. It's probably pushing 12 a.m., and I'm winding down what I'm working on and thinking about going to bed. Suddenly I hear a baby crying. My kids are like 6 and 9 at the time, so I go check and it isn't them. It sounds like it's outside, so I just peek out the door, and I see this misshapen thing pretty far off, sort of shambling up the sidewalk. No more baby sounds. By this point, I had stepped all the way outside and storm door slammed behind me. As it did, whatever it was turned around. I couldn't get a good view of it, and by the time it started to turn, I had quickly gone back inside. I don't often get freaked out easily, but this did the trick. I closed all windows, blinds, and curtains, and grabbed a machete saw thing I had. I stood at my closed front door, freaked out. Then I heard the footsteps come up to my door, only it sounded more like hoof steps or distorted high heel steps. I waited a few minutes, maybe 5 or so, after hearing the steps, and then opened the door, machete in hand. The neat stack of broken down boxes was knocked over. Not only knocked over, but almost fully covering my walkway, as if to muffle the footstep sounds that would have been made upon its exit. There was nothing else, no signs of it. I didn't learn till later of the sound skinwalkers make, which is what led me here to tell my story. Was it a skinwalker? Are they attracted to loneliness or negative emotions, sadness? Did it try to feed off my fear of thinking it was at my door? For weeks I was scared it would be there when I rounded the corners of my house. That's pretty much it. Thanks for reading if you made it this far. I don't know that's what I saw, but I thought you all might shed some light on it again. Like I said early, and probably a bad writer, but I just had to share. Thank you. My brother was killed by a skinwalker. It happened when we were kids, many years ago, on a camping trip with our dad in the Appalachian Mountains. The first night was uneventful, just the usual sounds of the wilderness. But on the second night, things started to feel off. It began with strange noises coming from the forest. Distant, unnatural sounds. My dad stayed up all night, listening, watching. The following day, we set out for a hiking trip to a cave we loved visiting. Everything seemed normal until we heard it. A voice. "Come here, sweetheart." My mother's voice. It was coming from the thick underbrush just off the trail. My dad and I instantly froze. Mom hated the forest. She had never come with us on any of our camping trips. There was no way she would be out here. That was the first red flag. But what really set me on edge was that she was only calling for my brother. Not me, not Dad, just him. My 9-year-old brother, excitable and full of energy, didn't even hesitate. The moment he heard our mother's voice, he bolted into the trees. We shouted for him to stop, but it was like our bodies refused to move, frozen, helpless. By the time we finally broke free of whatever invisible force held us in place, it was too late. We ran after him, desperate, panicked, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found. In the middle of the forest, standing over my brother's broken body, was something that should not exist. At first, my brain tried to rationalize what I was seeing. It looked like a deer, but it wasn't. It stood upright, balancing on 2 twisted, unnatural legs. Its arms were far too long, hanging down past its knees, limbs thin and sinewy like stretched leather pulled over bone. And then I saw its mouth, a gaping maw lined with jagged, predatory teeth, all of them stained red. And at its feet, my brother, lying motionless, his small body torn apart. My dad didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The thing snapped its head toward us, letting out an unearthly screech before lurching back into the darkness of the trees. But the damage was already done. My brother's stomach had been ripped open. There was nothing we could do. I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking, my mind trying to reject the reality in front of me. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in those mountains. It wasn't until later that I learned what we had encountered. A skinwalker, some kind of evil spirit, something that should never be spoken about. I don't want to know more. I don't want to remember. All I know is that I lost my brother that night, and that thing, it wore my mother's voice to take him away. This happened about 5 years ago, back when my girlfriend and I decided to go on a camping trip together. The campsite we chose was a popular getaway for couples, but we were lucky, or so we thought, to have the place mostly to ourselves. For the first 2 days, everything was perfect. We spent our time hiking through the dense forest, something we both loved. No strange encounters, no eerie sensations. But on the second day, things took a turn. Our plan was simple: hike in the morning, then return to camp for lunch. But when we got back, something was wrong. Our tent had been collapsed, not just knocked over, but completely trampled. Our belongings were scattered everywhere, some of them tossed several feet away. At first I assumed it was wildlife, but there were no signs of bears in the area. Coyotes, maybe? Unlikely. They tended to avoid campsites. We spent hours cleaning up the mess, but the entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. The sensation never left, even as the day went on and nothing else happened. The weight of unseen eyes stayed with me. That night was the worst of my life. I woke up around 1 a.m. The first thing I noticed was that the tent flap was open. The second, my girlfriend was gone. I scrambled outside, my heart hammering. The campfire was still burning, its dying embers casting a dim, flickering glow over the clearing, but she was nowhere to be seen. Then I heard her voice. It came from somewhere deep in the forest. "Come help me." It sounded just like her. Almost. Something in the tone was off, subtle but wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I hesitated, and then the voice drifted away, swallowed by the trees. And the growling started, low, guttural, inhuman. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to grab what I could and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. I needed to find her. I needed to save her. The next thing I remember is waking up in a psychiatric facility. Then I had no memory of what happened after I entered the woods. None. The doctors told me that they had found my girlfriend's mutilated body not far from the campsite. And me? I was found right next to her, weeping, crying uncontrollably, muttering something over and over again. I don't know what I was saying. I don't want to know. Tomorrow I'll be released, though her family pleaded with the authorities to keep me locked up. I can't say I blame them. If I were them, I wouldn't trust me either. Before I get into what happened, I need to explain something about the town I lived in at the time. This was 20 years ago, and back then there was a terrifying pattern of people disappearing. The strangest part? It didn't just happen at night. People were vanishing in broad daylight, sometimes from inside their own homes. I was 16, young and oblivious to the true danger of what was happening. One evening in October, I was home alone, waiting for my parents to return from a parent-teacher meeting with my sister. It was just another ordinary night, until I heard a knock at the door. Now, I wasn't a reckless kid. I knew better than to open the door for strangers. But when I glanced through the peephole, I froze. It was my mother. I reached for the handle automatically, about to let her in, until she spoke. Her voice was soft and familiar, but wrong. It was hers, yet it wasn't. Like someone was trying to imitate her, but didn't quite know how. And then the smell hit me. A stench so vile it made my stomach turn instantly. A mix of sulfur and decaying flesh. I doubled over, gagging, barely managing to stay upright. "Open the door, dearie. Don't keep me waiting." The words were gentle, coaxing, but beneath the tone was something calculated, predatory. She knocked again, harder this time. I tried to speak, to tell her to go away, to demand answers, but my throat locked up. My body refused to obey me, as though something was pulling me toward the door. My hand was already inches from the handle when blinding headlights flooded the room. The brightness snapped me out of whatever trance I had been in. My legs gave out, and my vision blurred. Everything went dark. I woke up the next morning, groggy and disoriented. The last thing I remembered was the knock at the door. My parents were standing over me, their expressions filled with concern and fear. Apparently, I had told them everything when they arrived home. Every horrifying detail, before I completely blacked out. But here's the part that still haunts me. They said when they pulled into the driveway they saw nothing. No figure standing outside, no twisted imitation of my mother. Just me, standing in front of the door, staring at something that wasn't there. To this day, I don't know what it was. But I know one thing for certain. If I had opened that door, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Huge footsteps and intense shaking. What I felt during this experience, it's taken me 2 years to comprehend in some way. I have had no real fear of these entities in the past. Do I believe they are real? Yes, with a grain of salt. In the sense of being and possessing animals, I believe certain things go beyond the realm of physical. How many of us have encountered skinwalkers, and haven't even noticed it was a spirit inhabiting that animal? A couple years back, I was camping in my GF's car during a trip down to northern New Mexico. I'm not unaccustomed to the way the forest works, as I've been an outdoorsman my whole life up in Colorado. What I experienced on this trip was a pivotal point for my life, as well as my relationship with the girl I was with at the time. We were in Angel Fire, New Mexico, driving around the forest at night looking for a flat surface to park the car and set up the bed in the back. We pulled off the side of a dirt country road, about 10 minutes drive from the highway. As we've done before on our mountain bike trips, we climbed into the back of the car and laid down for the night. The whole drive up to the parking/camp we were at, we talked about star signs and stuff like that, how it affects your personality, etc. She was always way more into that shit than me. I shared my views on it, and the ways they slightly disagreed with her beliefs of the supernatural. The conversation eventually got deeper and deeper in and turned to a spiritual topic that went on until after we laid down for bed. I shared about how my great-grandmother was a proclaimed psychic, about how my extended family believed there was punishment for multiple generations in my bloodline because of the things she did and the spirits she worked with, as my grandparents were devout Christians. At some point, while wrapping up my rant about my family, I felt an intense anxiety that took hold of nearly my whole body. I was shaking and frozen at the same time. My GF felt it in me. She started panicking, which was unusual. She said, "Something is going on here," in the shakiest voice I've ever heard. Next thing you know, we are praying, something we've never considered doing together. I hear footsteps that sound as heavy as a large bear, but bipedal, happening right outside the car. Now I understand that bears walk on 2 legs from time to time. I've seen lots of this, but the car we were in had heavy tints and a cover over the windshield. You couldn't see anything outside at night. After a while of praying, shaking in my boots, and continuing to hear these footsteps, they made their way across the road and out of our immediate territory. I get in the driver's seat and GTFO. We headed to an actual campground that had lots of other people. If it were a bear, I must have some really good primal instincts, because I began shaking and feeling fear well before we heard any footsteps. And I think a bear would put its front legs in the car if it were walking around the vehicle looking for a way in. I'll tell this story as best as I can remember. Frankly, I'm not sure if I believe it myself. Maybe my imagination got the better of me, or maybe my sense of fear took over. Regardless, these are the events present in my mind. Colorado is a place of such majesty, where mountains crest the heavens and the forests feel wild and free. I'm fortunate enough to live in a small town nestled underneath one of the state's great 400 0-foot peaks. Here, the aspens grow in groves between the evergreens, and deer walk freely between homes. My wife and I share a beautiful little wooden house with our lovely animals and enjoy the seclusion our town grants. About 1.5 years ago, on a clear autumn day, my wife and I had gotten into a heated argument. I couldn't tell you what we were fighting about now, only that it was likely one of the worst we had ever had. I remember being livid, and when we reached an ending point, I realized I desperately needed to calm myself back down and clear my head. Looking back, it feels quite childish of me, but still, angry, I exclaimed to my wife I was leaving for a bit, hopped in my little white car, and left the house. I took off into the national forest surrounding our town, driving aimlessly, not sure where I was going to end up, only that I needed to find a place that could bring me some peace. I drove for about 30 minutes, and without much thought, just turned left down a long dirt road, known for having a few campsites and a state park. I continued for another 30 minutes or so, with a few cars passing me occasionally, until I decided the place I was looking for needed to be completely secluded. So I turned down a small dirt road with no nautical signage or vehicles, continued for a minute and turned down another dirt road until I came to where it seemed to abruptly end. Perfect, I thought to myself as I pulled in. It was an excellent spot to be alone. Directly in front of where I parked was a lush grove of aspen trees. As I got out of my car, I was enveloped by the sound of the wilderness. The birds were singing, the wind blowing. I could hear little squirrels dancing across the treetops. Peace, perfect peace. I walked down an unmarked path that winded through the aspens and soaked in the feeling. My anger almost immediately melted away, and I remember feeling silly for being so mad in the first place. After about 5 minutes of walking, I looked deep into the aspen grove beside me. I could feel it calling to me to walk amongst the trees, and I was more than happy to oblige. I stepped off the path and walked through the untouched grove, enjoying every minute of the nature around me. The feeling of peace was overwhelming. I felt like a new man and was refreshed. The shimmering yellow leaves twirling in the branches above me were gorgeous and reminded me of video game graphics where the pixels dotted on and off. The wall of white aspens was mesmerizing, continuing row after row in all directions. The sound of the birds. Wait, I couldn't hear any birds. I stood there frozen and listened. Suddenly I could no longer hear any birds singing, nor any other animals like squirrels or chipmunks scurrying. There was only the faint sound of the wind blowing amongst the branches. It felt eerie. I began to walk back to the trail when I could swear I heard something that sent a shiver down my spine. Each of my footsteps made 2 sounds. I turned around, my eyes darting in every direction. I couldn't see any movement in the rows of aspens. I started walking again, and to my horror, the second set of footsteps could be heard behind me. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but if I were to guess, I'd say whatever was behind me trailed by maybe 20 meters. I stopped and looked 2 more times, trying to find some shape in the rows and rows of trees, but I couldn't see anything. I started walking faster, my body covered in goosebumps and my heart racing. I could hear it matching my pace, but the footsteps were inching closer and closer from what I could tell. At one point, something in me told me to not turn around again, keep going, get to the car. I made it back to the clearing where my car was parked, facing the forest I had left. I unlocked it as soon as I saw it. The footsteps were maybe 10 meters behind me now. As I left the forest trail and stepped into the clearing, it sounded like the footsteps had suddenly stopped. I didn't care though. I marched up to my car as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. I flung open the door and hopped in. I plunged my key into the ignition, and while my car burst into life, I looked up. I still think about what I saw. Those few seconds are burnt into my brain for forever. Everything else I could explain away by just hearing things and a feeling of dread, but I've never hallucinated before. When I looked up, deep amongst the rows of aspens in front of me, I saw a dark hand slowly retreat behind a tree. I reversed down the road at speed and drove straight home. When I got there, I immediately told my wife what happened, but she just kind of nodded her head, likely thinking I was just trying to change the mood after our argument. I still think about that day. Part of me wants to go back to that spot. I'm not sure if I want to prove to myself I'm not crazy or what, but I haven't built up the courage. Who knows, maybe my brain was grasping for a new feeling that day and decided fear would suffice. Or maybe I really did experience something born of Native American legend. I do know that sometimes when I stay up a little later than I should and my wife is asleep, I feel the same chill, like something is watching me through the window. This was originally a comment on some thread, but I never saved the link and was trying to remember where it is from. I've posted this one a couple times before, but seems fairly relevant. A personal experience that I had a while back. Still kind of messes with my head when I reread it. I'll be the first to say that all this stuff could have taken place in my head. The mind is a freaky thing and can play some pretty trippy tricks on you. Sorry for the length. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad had always told me that in life, you should not be scared of ghosts. Fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed suicide, and I received an inheritance from him. At time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month, and was in the process of finalizing all the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit work, packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog, and headed up in my dad's car that he had willed to me to the cabin. Now this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when we were not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the code for the alarms, so I did not feel the need to stop at the rental management company and advise them of my stay. This has nothing to do with the coming story, but felt the need to mention it anyway. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal, and nothing out of the unusual happened. Spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out on the balcony. Had already stocked up on food, cigarettes, and liquor, so I was pretty much a shut-in, aside from the occasional out to hit the slopes, with my dog as company and DVDs/PlayStation as entertainment. I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. Bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent either in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creeped me out. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog. His name was Midnight, by the way, and he also since passed. Playing games and watching DVDs. That day it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours, maybe a block away from each other. All other cabins aside from these 2 were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees. Multiple pine trees. This is important later on. Both these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days I knew that no one was currently staying there. Gave enough background and am going to jump to the weirdness. Around midday while outside with my dog, I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there in the last 20-30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying in the cabin near me that I may not have noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright. Whatever, the prints lead away from my cabin, and they disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. Disregarded the footprints and went back inside. Nighttime came around and decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up to a listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent. I was kind of freaked out and could hear him moving around downstairs, back and forth. After around 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he had to pee or that he wanted to go outside. Shit. Oh, fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to do his thing, only he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier, but he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go to where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit unusual for him, but all right. Maybe there are forest animals out there that he wants to chase down. But fuck this. Did not want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalized that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing. The steps seemed to be spaced apart like a man-length stride, so it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting for me to let him out. Alright, you know what? I'm a tough guy, and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. Fuck it, right? As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the roof with my light. Nothing there, and the snow on top was undisturbed. Weird. Must have been all my head. What about Midnight hearing the noise? Maybe he was feeding off my fear or paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. By the way, I am shaking right now and my heart is beating hard as I am typing this next bit. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch and its arms were extended above its head, holding onto the branch above it. Fuck me. What the fuck is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing and stood just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. The thing still did not move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. So I walked backwards to the inside of the room and pulled Midnight with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door, but at the same time I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and just stayed where I was, passed out eventually, and woke up in the morning and everything was normal. The rest of week I spent there was non-eventful and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I totally admit that it could have been all in my head. A lot of stuff was going on at the time, so I was pretty fucked up from all the drama.